Thank you very much, Sarah. It's my pleasure to add my greetings to Sarah's. We're especially happy to have you here, our guest from the community, of course. We appreciate those representatives from banks. I believe we have Southeast Bank represented in Barnett and Flagship and maybe others here. And of course, we have our Jacksonville International Trade Association well represented here today, along with other groups from the community. So we're especially happy to have you with us. And of course, to the members of our other educational institutions here, the Duval County Schools, University of North Florida, Jacksonville University, others, we're very pleased to have you. And of course, our own faculty members here. We bring you greetings also. We're especially pleased to have a number of outstanding speakers for you to interact with here today. I would just like to say just a word, Sarah, if I could, about our honors program at FJC. We always like to plug that program when we can. We have a program in which we offer $1,000 scholarships for the year, which an individual can receive 2 of these, or that is over 2 years, $2,000, which is above and beyond, as you'll recognize, Mr. Schultz, above and beyond our tuition here at the college, and provides a good incentive for students to be involved in honors programs. But we think the incentives are far above and beyond simply financial ones. That is, in that we have an outstanding faculty involved in our honors program. And this year we're adding even more, I think, more richness to the honors program. We are introducing in the process this year an honors core curriculum for those students, which will not only establish kind of a common educational experience for each of them, but it will also expose each of the students, regardless of their individual interest, to a broad variety of fields. And of course, it always provides this opportunity for scholastic inquiry and association, which we think is very important. This fall, the emphasis will be on the social sciences, and in the winter on the humanities core. And of course, the common theme for the entire academic year will be an in-depth study of the country of Japan and how we relate to that country. So we welcome you. We hope that you will follow along with us as we move ahead with this honors program through the year. And of course, we invite your continued association. It's my honor indeed to have an opportunity to introduce our kickoff speaker this morning. Back about 13 years and a few months ago, when I was named president of this college, I had an opportunity, I call it an opportunity, to go over to Tallahassee during the legislative session, and had an opportunity to meet with a very important person in that legislative delegation. In fact, this individual is Speaker of the House of Representatives of the state of Florida, none other than the Honorable Frederick Schultz. I remember seeing Fred in action in Tallahassee very early on, and he had instituted a number of processes which, I don't know who's in the room, I would like to say I wish we were in as good a shape with the legislature now as we were back then, because I thought we were in great shape. Did an outstanding job. Of course, Mr. Schultz did serve in the Florida House of Representatives for several years, specifically 1963 to 70, and of course was the Speaker 69-70. Also had many opportunities to follow that public service of Mr. Schultz over the years, because in 1971, then Governor Reuben Askew appointed him to chair the Citizens Committee on Education, which was a 2-year study on all of education in Florida, both public and private. And of course, later on, he became chairman of the Florida Education Council, 1976 to 77, and of course, has been a member of the National Council of Education Research, the policymaking board for the NIE, the National Institutes of Education. Now, of course, he has very recently been appointed to another major role in education. So we have had an opportunity to interact in educational circles with Mr. Schultz over the years, and will continue to do so. However, here locally, many of you have worked with him in the Chamber of Commerce. He was a past president of that organization, and of course, he was a founder of the Jacksonville Community Council, Inc., which we knew as JCCI back then, and of course, of Leadership Jacksonville. So we can see a local involvement at the state and local level, a tremendous involvement in providing leadership. I would like to make one comment about the appropriateness of Mr. Schultz in all of these areas, and that is, it's one thing, all of you teachers tell your students, is to be able to conceptualize ideas, to be able to think good thoughts, but to be able to reduce those to writing, to be able to articulate those and share those is very important. And I thought it might be of interest to you to note that Mr. Schultz was awarded the Lewis Brownlow Prize, which is given jointly by the Council of State Government and the American Association of Public Administration for the best published writing in the area of state government. He was awarded this in 1969. I think that's very important for all of us and all of our students to recognize. Of course, later on he became a Kennedy Fellow at Harvard, and of course has distinguished himself in the business world associated with the Barnett Bank, and of course Barnett Investment Services, chairman of the board, Florida WWII and Cable also. Presently, he's the senior advisor of Drexel Burnham Lambert, Inc. Since March of '82, and of course has been well known for many years as a private investor. A director of many organizations which you will recognize, such as Barnett Banks, American Heritage Life, Florida Steel, Southeast Atlantic Corp., Transco Energy Company, etc. Fred is a native of Jacksonville, attended school here, the Lawrenceville School, Princeton, and of course the University of Florida Law School, served distinguished military time in the United States Army during Korea, awarded the Bronze Star as an artillery officer there, and of course has 4 children, married to the former Nancy Jane Riley. It's my pleasure to present a good friend, someone who I consider in the educational circles a colleague, and of course someone I think will give us a great kickoff to this program this morning, the Honorable Frederick Schultz.
I hope that's the longest speech you hear this morning. Ben left out the thing that I'm perhaps proudest of, and that is that when I was in the legislature, I authored the bill that created Florida Junior College. So I thought at least you'd remember that one. I think he also neglected to tell you that I had a little hiatus in Washington for 3 years as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, which unfortunately took me out of action on the local level for a while and prevented me from doing some of the more enjoyable things like this, but it did provide a remarkable experience, certainly a remarkable learning experience for me, and gave me the opportunity to work with people who were dealing with Japan, at least on the economic and monetary level. I didn't spend a great deal of time with Governor Mayakawa, the head of the Central Bank of Japan, but I did have the opportunity to spend some time with him, both in Washington and at the meetings of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, which is sort of the central banker's central bank. And those were interesting experiences. In addition to which, I did have the opportunity to spend time with other prominent figures from Japan. The experience that I had with them and in Japan led me to be a great admirer of that country. As a matter of fact, I would think that you're going to have a very enjoyable day here. As you get into the subject of Japan, it is, I believe it would be fair to say, development of Japan since the Second World War is really unique in the history of the world. I can't think of an example of any country that has come so far so fast in such a short period of time. A country that was totally devastated in 1945 has now become the second-ranking world power and pushing the first-ranking world power very hard in a number of areas. They've done a great many things right. While we have been stubbing our toes and making enormous mistakes in Vietnam and in handling the inflationary problems of the 1970s, Japan has been doing a much better job of taking care of its difficulties and in making great forward progress. Relationships have been very good. I recall once when former Prime Minister Fukuda came to Washington, and he and Paul Volcker were old friends. Paul had been Under Secretary for Monetary Affairs at the same time that Fukuda was the finance minister. And they were involved in creating the new system of flexible exchange rates in 1971 when we broke the Bretton Woods Accords and went to floating exchange rates. And Fukuda calls Paul Ninja because I think you probably know that term better than I, but as my understanding that a ninja is sort of a ghost of a samurai who can move through walls and steals around in the night and that kind of thing. And that's what Paul did. It's very hard to miss Volcker because he's 6 feet 7 inches tall. And so he was trying to put all this together around the world, and he was flying into these countries in the middle of the night. He flew into Japan in the middle of the night, went into a hotel suite, worked all the next day with Fukuda, and they worked out the problems, and then he flew out in the middle of the next night. So Fukuda calls him Ninja. They make an interesting pair because Fukuda is not very big, and Paul is this enormous fellow. At any rate, he came to Washington and called Paul, and Paul got me, and Fukuda got the Japanese ambassador, and the four of us went to lunch. And after lunch, Paul leaned back and lit that cigar of his and said, "Fukuda-san, in the United States," this was early in 1981, just after the Reagan administration had come in. And he said, "Fukuda-san, here in Washington, they're saying that you were the first great supply sider, that your policies were just the kind that they're going to institute." And Fukuda leaned back and laughed, and he said, "In Japan, they call me the god of poverty." Because it took 5 years of firm fiscal and monetary restraint to get inflation under control, and they did it remarkably well. From 22.5 in 1974, they got the inflation rate down to under 4 5 years later. So, and they did it in what I think is the only way that it can be done. Coordinated policies of fiscal and monetary restraint. They did not make the kind of mistakes that we've been making the last 3 years in having a loose fiscal policy and a tight monetary policy, which creates very high interest rates and problems for the economy. At any rate, that's just, I think, one example of the fact that they have done things remarkably well. Remember that their problems were so much greater than ours. The oil shock of '73 affected them so much more than it did the United States. They import all of their energy in Japan. You must remember this is a country relatively small in land size, at least the kind of the amount of land that you can live on, or the amount of arable land there is. Country of almost 120 million people now, living in a land land area that's basically the size of Connecticut. So, and a country with very little in the way of natural resources, having to import practically everything that they use. And the oil shock was immense to them. And that's what caused the very high inflation rate in Japan. And yet they were willing to take the necessary steps to overcome those problems. And I think that that's been the kind of history of Japan that you have seen since the Second World War. I recently spent 6 weeks in the Far East. As you heard, I'm a senior advisor to a Wall Street firm, Drexel Burnham Lambert. And my job for them is making talks and meeting with their institutional clients around the world. And last year I've been on 4 swings around Europe and North Africa, and then the 6 weeks in the Far East. I came back from that trip and told our people in New York that they should advise all of our institutional clients who have holdings in other countries around the world to concentrate their efforts in the Pacific Rim, because that clearly is where the action is. And we then advised our clients to cut back on the European holdings and to increase the holdings in Japan. I think that it is critical, as you look at Japan, to look at the history and culture of the country. This is the area where, in my judgment, the United States has made its great policy mistakes. We seem to think that we can impose our philosophy on other countries. And we just don't seem to understand that things that might be workable for us are not workable for other countries. And that to understand why they do the things they do, whether it's Russia or whether it's Tanganyika, you've got to understand their history and culture. If you want to know what makes them tick, these things are critical. In the case of Japan, perhaps even more important than almost any other country. So I think that what you're going to do today is vital to an understanding, and what you're going to do in future meetings is vital to an understanding of Japan and our relationships with them. Well, let me just make a few points that certainly not all inclusive by a long shot, but a few points that might be worth your further discussion. If you believe in Arnold Toynbee's thesis of challenge and response, Japan is a remarkable example. In the early 1840s, you had the Opium Wars in China. Remember, at this point in time, both China and Japan were countries that were basically closed to foreigners. Not totally. There were small points of entry. Nagasaki in Japan had small Dutch colonies, and ships came in there. And there were one or two points of entry in China. But essentially, these countries were closed. The Opium Wars in the early 1840s, the Western powers instituted a series of treaties, including extraterritoriality. The response of China was to withdraw even further inward. Quite the contrary. When Perry came into Japan in the middle 1850s, the Japanese response was totally different. They decided that they were not going to, in effect, take that line down. Remember, this is an enormous blow to the pride of these countries. China, in particular, thought of itself as the country of the world, the history, the culture. Nothing else was very important. I don't think the Japanese ever felt that to quite the same degree, but they felt it to a considerable degree. And yet, when they were given this tremendous challenge, the Chinese folded up. The Japanese, in effect, decided to try to meet the challenge. And that resulted in the Meiji Restoration in the latter part of the 1860s. By 1895, Japan was a power. In that short period of time, they had become westernized to the degree where they were victorious in 1895 against the Chinese, 1905 against the Russians. They responded to the challenge in a remarkable way. The same thing has taken place after the Second World War. As I've said, here's a country just totally devastated that has made remarkable strides since the Second World War. An amazing period of history. Another factor that you certainly have to consider as you look at Japan is the question of expansionism. You're aware of what the Japanese attempted to do before the Second World War. They did it in response to basically the same kind of pressures that you saw in Germany. Large population, small land area. The Germans called it Lebensraum, living room. The Japanese was the Pan-Asian effort. But essentially the same kind of thing. They had the strength in many other ways, but needed the raw material resources, access to them. Their effort prior to the Second World War was to do it by conquering territory. Their effort to do it now is equally as strong, but it comes in a different way. They are buying things in other countries. They are exporting capital. It's one of the things that makes the yen, as weak as it is, you would think the yen would be much stronger. There are various reasons for it. One of them, of course, is that they are exporting the yen. They are buying factories. They are setting up factories in a great many countries around the world. So they are expanding in a very different kind of a way than they did before. A third point that I think is important is to recognize their tremendous adaptability. Think of what they did after the Second World War, when MacArthur came in and imposed a kind of government which was basically entirely foreign to them. And yet they have taken that Constitution and used it very effectively. They have adapted to a very different kind of political system. They've certainly done it in management. They took the ideas of an American, Frederick Deming, in the early 1950s. We had this, those ideas were available in the United States. Fred Deming had written a book. But it was ignored in the United States. The Japanese took those ideas and developed them into a very strong management system. And it's not a question in Japan of government control giving them this big advantage. The fact is they've done a remarkable job. I remember when I was on the Federal Reserve Board and was looking at the question of what we were going to do about office automation. The Federal Reserve is a big organization, some 25,000 people, and we use a lot of machines. We had a couple $100 million of computers, and it was clear that the whole office automation thing was going to be critical to that system. And so I spent a day at IBM with John Opel and Paul Rizzo, and a day at Westinghouse with Bob Kirby. They had both sent teams to Japan to look at the management systems. They both came back with the same answers. Look, these people aren't doing anything that radically different. Sure, quality circles and these kinds of things. But essentially, they were just managing better. They were doing a better job. Their inventory controls were better. A lot of things they were doing were better. So they haven't invented anything. The management area, really, they've just taken ideas that were available to everybody and used them better than anybody else. In the scientific area, the Japanese are not great inventors. They're not great creators in those areas. But what they do is they take inventions of others and hone them and refine them, and they produce them better than other people. Their adaptability is their ability to adapt and to use the ideas of others really quite remarkable. Well, one more comment about their organization and management. They have been extraordinarily good at group dynamics, and they have handled their people well. Again, though, this is not something which is transferable, I think. A lot of the things that you will learn about Japan, that Japan does, are, in my judgment, not transferable. It is critical to understand the culture of countries to find out what is transferable. If you talk about their management system, a lot of it is not transferable. We are not likely, I think, to be willing to have our workers come to work every morning and take exercise breaks that are done as a group. In education, I do want to talk about that a little bit, but it's, in my judgment, very clear that a lot of the things that they do in Japan, A, we don't want, but B, we can't use. It would not be transferable. But they have done a remarkable job of getting people to work together. Their group dynamics has been outstanding. Now, this organization and management ability that they have may become a matter of great importance in what happens in the Pacific Rim. There are a lot of people who have been thinking for some years now of what a tremendous combination it would be if you had Japan with its trained people, its organization and management abilities working very closely with mainland China with their enormous population and resources. And that, I think, is something which is likely to be more and more in people's minds, because the Chinese are moving in such a way that that will become increasingly possible. Remember that China now is a country which went through this so-called Cultural Revolution from 66 to 76, in which the theory was just to break down totally the old society, the old meritocracy, the old Confucianist ideas, so that they could start a new society. Well, part of that process, they closed all the universities, all the intellectuals, all the academicians, all the managers of factories were sent out to the communes to work in the fields. Many of them were imprisoned. They destroyed their intelligentsia in the Cultural Revolution. It's remarkable that you spend time there now, and all the people tell you how they hated the Cultural Revolution. None of them blame it on Mao. It's really quite remarkable. He, of course, was the father of it, but they blame it on the Gang of Four, and they all talk about smashing the Gang of Four. You hear this, you hear this phraseology a great deal. But you now have a very pragmatic administration in China. The recent developments in the economic sphere have really been quite remarkable. After several years of experimentation, you now have a system. Nobody can own land in China except the state. You can have enough to build a house on if you want to, and it goes with the house. You sell the house, but you never own that land. But every farmer now gets to keep part of what he produces and can sell it in the free market, and there's a free market in every city. In January of this year, they instituted a new change whereby instead of taking all the profits from the factories, they now tax the factories. So, and the factory manager gets to keep part of the profits. Well, that means a whole different ballgame. That factory manager now has to be concerned about pricing. He has to be concerned about costs. He has to, and he gets to keep part of that money, so he has to be concerned with what to do with it. Does he use it for capital investment, or does he pay it bonuses and incentives to his workers? A whole new ballgame in terms of how they manage their economy. but they're desperate for trained people who can run these kinds of organizations. And Japan offers them that kind of opportunity, lots of trained management. So this could be a very interesting kind of connection. We are doing more, of course, with mainland China. I hope we continue to do more. That's a country that's on the move. But the Japanese are, I think, going to take greater advantage of that opportunity than we are. One comment about the educational system. It certainly is an excellent educational system. If you go into the classroom, you are amazed, first of all, by the discipline. That's what strikes you, I think, more than any other thing, is the discipline in the classrooms. And of course, the emphasis on the basics and the fact that they take all of these tests at different levels, essentially very similar to the old meritocracy that you had in China, but in a very different kind of a milieu. The problem with the Japanese system is that it doesn't do much to enhance creativity and entrepreneurship, and that's the advantage that we have. It's interesting to note, last year in the United States, we had about 25,000 corporations that filed for bankruptcy. Now, I'm going to compare apples and oranges a little bit here because I don't have any other figures to use. That does not represent the total number of businesses in this country that ceased to do business. There were a lot more than that, but still that was the figure for filings for bankruptcy. The number of new incorporations in this country last year was about 550,000. An enormous jump to the number of new businesses that are coming into being. It is still true in this country we have a lot of people that are willing to step out and start something new. They don't have that. There's not the opportunity in Japan, but there's not that kind of tradition either. Now, they recognize their problems in the creativity area. They are attempting to move their educational system closer to ours. They are attempting to do some of the things that will try to develop greater creativity. They're doing more writing in the schools. So that they're attempting to bring their educational system a little closer to ours. We certainly have things to learn from them, but I don't think their educational system is adaptable or desirable in its entirety for us. Well, what about the possible weaknesses that Japan might have? Well, Japan is a very proud country. One of the things that was fascinating to me, I had spent a good deal of time in Japan in the early 50s. I revisited Japan, and of course at that time it was just devastated. I remember standing at ground zero at Hiroshima. And, it was an awful thing. They hadn't started the rebuilding, and here for just a mile around me, it was just flat. Just absolutely flat. There wasn't anything there. And the country, it was kind of you had the feeling that represented the country to a great degree. I came back in 1958, and they had been making great strides, but they were still, you had a feeling of great diffidence. Of course, the Japanese are very diffident people. They're very polite people, very pleasant people to be around. But in 1958, the feeling was that they didn't have very much self-confidence. They had been flattened. And I also got the feeling that Americans still were not very popular in Japan at that point in time, that the Japanese wanted to learn from us, they admired us, they didn't much like us. The last time I was there, this spring, I got quite a different feeling. I got a feeling of great confidence on the part of the people. Those that I talked to I had another meeting with Prime Minister Fukuda. I met with Aichi Nakao, who is one of the top people in Nakasoni's faction. I met with a number of the businessmen and industrialists. And just the meetings that I had up and down the line, the now people that were very confident and very proud. Every right to be proud. But you've got to remember this is also a country where that pride turned into hubris before the Second World War, where they thought they could beat anybody. And will this kind of thing happen again? I don't know, but I do think it's something that can be watched with some care. Well, Japan is going to be increasingly important to the United States. They're going to be a competitor, and yet they share so many of the same interests that we have in what happens to the world today. Their goals are so similar to ours in many ways, and so I think that there'll be increasing interaction between our countries, communication, transportation, and particularly world trade. Almost 20% of gross world product today is now in international trade. The number continues to grow. Of the industrialized nations of the world, only the United States is less than 20%. All the others are more. So this increasing emphasis on world trade is going to be vital, and it's going to mean that the interaction between our countries is going to be greater all the time. I think this interchange of product and ideas will bring us closer together. Japan is a country that represents marvelous things in the beauty of its countryside and particularly in its art. I just don't think that there's anything in the world any more beautiful than some of the really fine old Japanese screens. And if you ever have the opportunity to go to the National Museum and see some of them, it's certainly worth doing. But it's a country we're going to see a lot of. It's a country we're going to work with a great deal. And I'm delighted that you have this program and that you're going to take the opportunity. Certainly here in Jacksonville, we're going to be having more and more interaction. And I think it's going to be valuable for you and for those with whom you teach and those that you deal with. So have a very nice